The red recording light came on, and here we are for another episode of Story Slices. For those of you who are just joining, my name is Lucas and I share real stories from Reddit showing how some people just ignore boundaries and end up facing the consequences of their own actions. Today's episode is about ownership, boundaries, and a neighbor who thought she had rights over a space that wasn't hers. A sealed door became the center of a legal battle that cost one of the parties over $100,000. And no, it wasn't me. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. Everything started when I finally achieved my dream at 38. I bought an industrial warehouse to expand my workshop for restoring old furniture. Business was growing, and I needed space for bigger projects, especially the historical pieces that museums sent me for restoration. The property was perfect. Not only was it spacious with high ceilings, but it was also in a prime location. During the inspection, I noticed an old metal door sealed shut with concrete on the side wall that shared a boundary with a neighboring architecture studio. The realtor explained that the buildings had been constructed in the 70s as one property, but they were legally divided and sold separately in the 90s. 3 days after moving in, I was setting up my workspace when a well-dressed woman walked in through the front door without announcing herself. "Finally, we get to meet the new neighbor," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Alessandra, the owner of the studio next door." I tried to be friendly, offered her some coffee while she looked around my space critically. "So, when are you going to open up that door between our buildings?" she suddenly asked. Confused, I explained that I had no plans for that, as the properties were separate. She laughed condescendingly. No. I have the original 1975 blueprints. It's a shared entrance. I need that access to welcome my VIP clients from your side. The industrial look would perfectly match our events." I tried to politely explain that regardless of old blueprints, our properties were legally separate, with distinct deeds. The door was permanently sealed. Her smile vanished. "Look, I have celebrities and important businessmen visiting my studio regularly. That access is essential for my business. I'm sending a team to open the passage next week." The next morning, Alessandra sent a formal email demanding the door be opened, claiming historical rights of way based on blueprints that were 50 years old. I checked my deed, nothing mentioned a shared access. A week later, I arrived at the workshop to find a dumpster placed against the external wall, strategically positioned near the sealed door. I immediately called Alessandra. "I had someone put it there so we could start the work," she replied as if it were obvious. "My clients need that access. The governor is visiting my studio next month. You're not authorized to make changes to my property," I said calmly. "Please remove the dumpster today." "Don't be so territorial," she shot back. "It's just a door. We'll both benefit. Your rustic projects will add charm to my space during events." I removed the dumpster and installed security cameras facing that wall. It turned out to be a good decision. The next day, the cameras recorded 2 men with cutting tools checking out the sealed door. I confronted them and found out they were hired by Alessandra. The following days were a nightmare. Her employees accidentally entered my workshop through the front door, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. One time, I even caught one of them taking photos of my inside space while I was assisting a client. I decided to consult my lawyer, Roberto. He studied the deed, the current blueprints, and the history of the property. "Good news and bad news," he said after his analysis. "The bad news is that she's not going to give up easily. The good news, and this is surprising, is that I found something interesting in the measurements of the lot." Roberto pointed to the blueprint. Her building was encroaching about 15 centimeters into my property. It was an advantage I wasn't expecting. "Let's use that only if absolutely necessary," I advised, still hoping to resolve the situation diplomatically. I sent Alessandra a formal notice, reaffirming my property rights and asking her to stop the unauthorized access attempts. Her response was a threat of a lawsuit for obstruction of a historical passage and impact on business. Things got worse when my employees, Tiago, Juliana, and Carlos, started being approached by her staff, trying to convince them to leave the door unlocked after business hours. The situation even became an inside joke at the workshop, with Tiago suggesting we install a fake door that led to a broom closet. The summons came on a Friday. Alessandra was seriously suing me, demanding immediate access and compensation for commercial losses due to the sealed door. In court, Judge Lorenzo, a serious man with graying hair, examined the evidence meticulously. Alessandra presented her arguments with excessive confidence, brandishing yellowed 1975 blueprints and old photographs. Your Honor, this access always existed. It's a historical right that the defendant is arbitrarily denying, harming my business and the experience of my important clients. Roberto calmly and precisely presented our defense, separate deeds, the absence of a registered easement, and finally, an engineer's report confirming that the properties were structurally independent. The turning point came when the judge asked Alessandra directly, "Could you show us in any legal document made after the division of the properties where this right of passage is guaranteed?" She hesitated and once again referred to the old blueprints. The judge shook his head. The 1975 blueprints reflect a reality that no longer legally exists. These properties were properly divided and sold separately. There's no legal basis for your claim. Roberto then presented our counterclaim, revealing the 15-centimeter encroachment of her structure onto mine, along with video recordings of her attempts to damage my wall and the unauthorized entries. Alessandra's face went pale when the judge reviewed the videos. Judge Lorenzo took off his glasses and looked directly at Alessandra. The courtroom fell completely silent. In 22 years on the bench, I've rarely seen a case as baseless as this one, he declared in a firm voice. Not only does the plaintiff have no legal foundation for her claims, but the evidence shows an alarming pattern of property invasions. Alessandra tried to interrupt, but the judge raised his hand. "I'm not finished yet. The recordings clearly show that you instructed your employees to damage private property and to break into a commercial establishment without permission. That constitutes a crime, not just a civil dispute." The decision was ruthless, complete rejection of Alessandra's lawsuit and full approval of our counterclaim. She would be held responsible for all legal costs, had to correct the 15-centimeter encroachment in her structure, and pay compensation for the damages. When we left the court, Roberto looked satisfied but not surprised. "I never doubted the outcome," he commented. "But now comes the practical part. She needs to understand that this is not up for negotiation." In the following days, the reality of the judicial decision began to sink in for Alessandra. Correcting the structural encroachment was no simple task, it required partial demolition and rebuilding of her studio's lateral wall. 3 different contractors estimated the cost between 55 and 72,000 reais, not counting the disruption of her studio's activities during the work. Legal fees added another 35,000, and the compensation was set at 25,000. In less than a month, the judicial defeat had turned into a financial catastrophe of more than 130,000 reais for her. Surprisingly, after the verdict, Alessandra tried to negotiate. Her new lawyer, her previous one had withdrawn, made a proposal. She would drop the compensation if I agreed to keep the original door, simply locked on my side, without needing to rebuild the lateral wall. "Absolutely not," I replied after consulting Roberto. "The ruling is clear, and we will make no exceptions. The encroachment must be fixed and the door will be permanently replaced with a solid wall." Her lawyer sighed. "She really needs to understand that she lost, huh?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "This isn't a negotiation, it's about upholding a court decision." During the corrections, we uncovered something revealing. The contractor in charge found old documents hidden inside the wall structure, draft letters and notices addressed to the previous owners of my warehouse, all written by Alessandra over the past 15 years demanding the same type of access she tried to impose on me. "That's a pattern of behavior," Roberto said when I showed him the documents. "She's been trying to bully neighbors for years." Employees at the architecture studio started resigning as their financial situation deteriorated. Tiago, who had contacts in the design market, told me that the rumor about Alessandra's behavior spread quickly across the industry. "No one wants to work for someone who doesn't respect basic boundaries," he commented as we finished restoring an 18th century writing desk. Design professionals value ethics and common sense. The correction work lasted 3 weeks. The wall was rebuilt properly within the correct boundaries, and on my side, I replaced the old seal door with a reinforced concrete wall, symbolically much sturdier than the previous one. Juliana even suggested we hang a decorative sign that read, "Here lies a terrible idea." Everyone laughed, but I decided to use the space to display some of our vintage restoration tools. Meanwhile, our workshop continued to prosper with new projects, including a newly signed contract with the National History Museum to restore colonial-era furniture, and the architecture studio began to decline visibly. Clients were cancelling visits, and fewer people were seen entering the neighboring building. One Wednesday afternoon, I noticed a "for sale" sign on the facade of the studio. A week later, moving trucks started hauling away furniture, equipment, and office materials. "Looks like she's given up," commented Carlos as we polished an oak dining table. "I think she underestimated the real cost of ignoring other people's boundaries." Alessandra's last day at the building was surprisingly quiet. I watched from a distance as she handed over the keys to a realtor and left without looking back. There was no final confrontation, no bitter words, just the silent closing of an unpleasant chapter. That night, I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion and poured a glass for each of my employees. To justice, I toasted, and to the strength of well-built walls. Everyone laughed and added their own humorous cheers. The mood at the workshop, now free from the constant tension of the past few months, was one of genuine relief and celebration. "You know what's ironic?" Juliana observed. She wanted that access so badly to impress clients with our space, but she never asked if we could work together legitimately, as business partners. That remark stayed with me for days. In fact, a proper business partnership could have benefited both businesses if it had been proposed respectfully and within the law. But Alessandra chose the path of imposition, not cooperation. 6 months have passed since the architecture studio was sold. Our workshop kept growing and, with the additional space, I even hired 2 new restorers to meet the rising demand. Museum projects became our most profitable specialty, challenging us with fascinating technical tasks and earning us recognition in historical conservation. One Monday morning, while I was cataloguing new pieces, Roberto called with an unexpected update about Alessandra. "Remember your ex-neighbor? I just found out she sued her own lawyer for misrepresentation in our case." "You must be kidding," I replied incredulously. "Not at all." She claimed he didn't adequately inform her about the risks of the case. Obviously, the case was dismissed and she had to pay the costs. Apparently, she moved to the south and now works as a real estate agent. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. I hope she at least learned something about respecting property boundaries. "Doubtful," Roberto said. "People like her rarely change." A few weeks later, I noticed some movement in the neighboring building. A design team was renovating the space, replacing the old austere look of the studio with something more contemporary and inviting. Soon after, a new sign was installed, Perspectiva Design and Kriakau. The new owners, Daniel and Sophia, came by to introduce themselves during the second week after the reopening. They were a couple of designers in their 30s, with a modern and collaborative approach to interior design. "We just wanted to get to know our neighbor," Sophia said with a genuine smile. "Your restoration workshop has an excellent reputation." The conversation flowed naturally as we showed each other our spaces. Unlike Alessandra, they clearly respected the physical boundaries between the properties, even joking about the newly built concrete wall. "We've heard some stories about the previous owner," Daniel commented diplomatically. "I want you to know that we operate quite differently." "I'm glad to hear that," I replied, offering coffee while we discussed possible collaborations. Interestingly, Sophia was the first to suggest a proper partnership. "We work with contemporary interior design, but many of our clients appreciate the blend with restored historical pieces. It might be interesting to work on projects together, if you're open to it." This was exactly the kind of cooperation Alessandra never considered, one based on mutual respect and shared benefits. In the following weeks, we established a productive business relationship. We started referring clients to one another. When I finished an important restoration, I recommended Perspectiva Design services to showcase the piece in the right setting. When they worked on residential projects, they referred their clients to my workshop to restore family heirlooms or find appropriate historical pieces. The first joint project came 3 months later, the renovation of a historic house whose owner wanted to preserve original elements while updating its functionality. Daniel and Sophia came up with the overall concept, while my team carefully restored the original wooden features and crafted new pieces to complement the period style. The result was so impressive that we were invited to present it in a decorating magazine, bringing visibility to both businesses. During the photo session, Sophia mentioned how mutually beneficial our collaboration was. "Imagine if we had just torn down walls without talking it over," she joked, clearly aware of the previous saga. "We would have missed the chance to build something far more valuable, trust." In an ironic twist, when the magazine was published, one of our clients mentioned that they knew Alessandra. "She tried to convince me to use her studio to renovate my house last year," they explained. "But something in her approach bothered me. It felt like my home would just be a stage for her ideas, not a truly personalized project." At the end of the first year, as neighbors with Daniel and Sophia, we celebrated with a joint dinner between our two teams. During the toast, Daniel raised his glass and said, "To good neighbors and the walls between us, not as barriers, but as clear definitions that let us collaborate better." Everyone agreed enthusiastically. Tiago, always with his characteristic humor, added, "And to the door that never really needed to exist." While we talked and planned future projects, I couldn't help but reflect on how a conflict that could have been destructive ended up paving the way for a genuinely beneficial partnership. Alessandra's insistence on tearing down physical and legal boundaries only led to her own downfall, while respecting those same boundaries allowed us to build far more valuable bridges. Today, my restoration workshop serves clients all over the country, with pieces regularly sent to international exhibitions. Perspectiva Design has become one of the most sought-after studios in the region, with an approach that values both innovation and historical preservation. "And that solid wall I built where the sealed door used to be?" Ironic enough, Daniel and Sophia decided to install a display window right next to it, a space where we occasionally showcase restored pieces from our workshop that complement their projects, visible from both the studio and the street. As I always tell new clients who hear this story, the best relationships aren't built by tearing down walls, but by respecting them and building proper doors, when, and only when, both sides agree. Today I want to share 2 other interesting stories I received from channel followers. They also deal with boundaries and relationships, but in ways different from my experience with Alessandra. The first story comes from Mariana, a 26-year-old follower who went through a tricky situation during her dream vacation. Mariana saved money for 3 years for a 2-week trip to Europe with her boyfriend, Ricardo, who is 29. They planned every detail meticulously: the boutique hotels in Paris, the boat trips in Amsterdam, the restaurants in Rome. "We were at the airport, about to board, when Ricardo got a call from his parents," Mariana wrote. "They decided, at that very moment, that they wanted to join us on the trip. Not as a suggestion, but as a done deal. They had already bought tickets for the same flight." Ricardo, without consulting Mariana, immediately replied, "Of course, it's going to be amazing." The couple had planned a romantic getaway with cozy hotel suites and flexible itineraries. Now suddenly it was going to be a family trip with his 60-year-old parents, whom Mariana barely knew since they had only been together for 8 months. "I was paralyzed," she continued. "Ricardo looked at me all radiant and said, 'Isn't it wonderful? My parents have never been to Europe.' When she tried to express her discomfort, Ricardo accused her of being selfish. 'Family always comes first,' he insisted. 'We can have romantic moments on any trip.' During the flight, Ricardo's parents began taking over, rearranging the itinerary to include more museums and cutting out frivolous things like candlelit dinners and gondola rides that Mariana had planned. On the second night, in Paris, Ricardo announced he had cancelled our suite to save money, and booked a room with 2 twin beds for us, next to his parents' room, Mariana recounted. When I protested, he called me immaterialistic. The last straw came during a dinner in Rome. Ricardo's parents openly criticized Mariana's choices while he stayed silent. When she suggested spending a morning alone shopping, his mother declared, "Trips are for culture, not for frivolity. You're already wasting our son's money." That night, Mariana made a decision. She booked a flight home, moved to a separate hotel for the 2 days she had to wait, and sent a simple message to Ricardo: "When you're ready to respect my boundaries and our plans, we can talk. Until then, I wish you and your parents a good family trip." Ricardo reacted with indignation, calling her dramatic and disappointing. He sent dozens of messages alternating between anger and pleading for her to come back, all emphasizing how his parents were hurt by her attitude. Mariana returned home alone and, 2 weeks later, when Ricardo came back, he tried to act as if nothing had happened. "He showed up at my door with a present from Paris, expecting me to just let it go," she wrote. "When I explained that we needed to talk about boundaries and respect, he said I was making a mountain out of a molehill." That's when Mariana realized the pattern wouldn't change. "I understood I'd always be placed second, and any attempt to set boundaries would be labeled as selfish," she concluded. "I ended the relationship that very night." The last update I received from Mariana was uplifting. She rebooked the trip to Europe, alone, 6 months later. "It was liberating," she wrote. "I visited exactly the places I wanted, at my own pace, without judgment. I met amazing people in hostels and made friendships that continue to this day. I learned that respecting my own limits isn't selfish, it's self-care." The second story comes from Lucas, a 32-year-old man who faced a complex situation involving his religious family and his identity. Lucas grew up in an extremely religious family in the countryside, where his homosexuality was seen as a sinful choice. At 18, after a traumatic family intervention that even involved attempts at conversion therapy, he cut ties with almost all relatives and moved to the capital. "I built my life from scratch," Lucas wrote. "I graduated in engineering, built a solid career, and found friends who became my chosen family. After years of therapy, I learned to accept who I am and live openly." 10 years after he left, Lucas received an unexpected message from his younger brother, Gabriel, who was then 25. Gabriel was just a teenager when Lucas left home and, unlike their parents, he held positive memories of his brother. He wrote saying he missed me and wanted to get to know me as an adult, Lucas recalled. "I have to admit, my first reaction was fear. Was this a trap for another intervention?" After weeks of cautious messaging, Lucas agreed to meet Gabriel at a cafe in his city. The initial conversation was tense and filled with uncomfortable silences. "It was strange to look at my little brother now as an adult," Lucas remembered. "He seemed nervous, almost scared. Finally, Gabriel revealed the true reason for reaching out. I always knew the way you were treated was wrong. I now have my own family, a little son, and I don't want to repeat our parents' mistakes. I want my son to know Uncle Lucas." The meeting ended with a hesitant hug, the first physical contact between the brothers in a decade. In the following weeks, Gabriel shared that he had distanced himself from the family's more extreme dogmas, though he still maintained his faith in a more moderate way. "He even invited me to meet my nephew, Mateus, who is 3, wrote Lucas. I was terrified at the thought of getting close to the family again, even if only partially." The real test came when Lucas finally visited Gabriel's house and met his wife, Anna, and little Mateus. During lunch, Lucas's cell phone rang and a picture of his boyfriend, Pedro, popped on the screen. "There was a moment of palpable tension," Lucas recalled. "Gabriel looked at the photo, then at me, and then said something I'll never forget: 'You should bring him along next time. Mateus loves meeting new people.'" That simple sentence marked the beginning of a gradual reconciliation. Not with his parents, who remained unyielding, but with this new branch of the family that Lucas never imagined he'd have. "Last year, Pedro and I were the godparents at the baptism of Gabriel and Anna's youngest daughter," Lucas concluded. "It isn't a perfect story, there are still awkward moments and topics we avoid. But it's a story of growth. Gabriel set his own boundaries with our parents, choosing to build a family based on acceptance, not judgment. Lucas's journey reminds me that boundaries aren't just there to keep people out, they're also meant to define safe spaces where healthy relationships can flourish. As he himself wrote, sometimes, the greatest act of love is saying that's not acceptable to me, and the greatest act of growth is listening to that with respect. These stories, just like my encounter with Alessandra, share a common theme, the transformative power of setting and maintaining healthy boundaries. For Mariana, it meant valuing her own desires and plans. For Lucas, it was about creating a protective distance followed by a cautious reconnection on his own terms. For me, it was about defending my physical and legal property against unjust intrusion. The characters in these narratives, Ricardo and his parents, Lucas's family, Alessandra, share an inability to recognize and respect other people's boundaries. As a result, they lost relationships, opportunities, and, in Alessandra's case, substantial financial resources. In contrast, those who learned to respect limits, Sophia and Daniel, Gabriel and his new family, Mariana on her solo journey, discovered new ways to connect authentically and grow personally. These stories make me reflect on the fact that setting healthy boundaries isn't an act of hostility, it's self-care and, paradoxically, a more solid foundation for genuine relationships. When Daniel and Sophia respected the physical separation between our businesses, we created a partnership much more valuable than anything Alessandra could have forced through her invasive tactics. Life constantly challenges us to identify and defend our personal, professional, emotional, and, or as in my case, physical, boundaries. Every time we allow someone to cross those lines without consequence, we set a dangerous precedent. I often wonder how different things would have been if Alessandra had simply knocked on my door and proposed a legitimate partnership from the start. Maybe we could have organized joint events, shared clients, or even created a consensual passage between our buildings, with the proper contracts and clear limits. But her approach, rooted in imaginary rights and intimidation, made any collaboration impossible. Likewise, if Ricardo's parents had respected the couple's space while suggesting occasional visits during the trip, they might have built a more positive relationship with Mariana. If Lucas's family had respected his identity from the beginning, they might have maintained a lasting relationship with him instead of losing a decade of connection. What these stories have taught me is that boundaries aren't walls to isolate, but clear lines that allow for more authentic and respectful interactions. When we know where our rights end and someone else's begin, we can navigate relationships more safely and generously. At my workshop, we now regularly collaborate with Perspectiva Design. Each of us operates in our own space, with clear contracts and transparent expectations. The result? Award-winning projects, satisfied clients, and genuine friendship between our teams. The irony isn't lost on me. The solid wall I built to replace the sealed door ended up laying the foundation for a metaphorical bridge that's far more valuable. As for Alessandra, I recently heard that she's building a questionable reputation in her new career as a real estate agent, with complaints about inaccurate property representations and attempts to pressure buyers. Apparently, some lessons are just hard to learn. If you face similar situations, whether at work, in your family, or in relationships, I'd love to hear your story. How did you set and defend your boundaries? What were the consequences? The comments are open so we can share our experiences. Before closing, I want to thank each and every one of you for following Story Slices. This channel has become a space to discuss real experiences that many of us go through but rarely share openly. If this story, or any other, has helped you reflect on your own boundaries, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Every week, we bring new narratives about the challenges of navigating personal and professional relationships in this complex world we live in. Remember, setting boundaries isn't about building walls, it's about clearly defining where your space ends and someone else's begins, whether that space is physical, emotional, or professional. In the next episode, I'll share the story of a university professor who faced a student who thought he deserved high grades without doing the required work, a different kind of entitled behavior that resulted in unforeseen consequences. Until then, take good care of your limits, they are the foundation of your mental peace and healthy relationships. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. As I always say when wrapping up projects in the workshop, sometimes the most important piece you restore is your own sense of worth. And that's not up for negotiation. A big hug, and see you next time.